I'm Warren Hoge, IPI Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Beyond the Headlines event featuring Vali Nasr and his new book, The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat. Vali spoke here at IPI 4 years ago in connection with his last book, which was called Forces of Fortune: The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. In it, he made the argument that there was a vital but unseen rising force in the Islamic world, a new business-minded middle class that was building a vibrant new Muslim world economy and that held the key to winning the Cold War against Iran and extremists. I read that book as an optimistic one. I didn't emerge with anything like that feeling on reading Vali's new book, The Dispensable Nation. A lot has happened in the world that Vali was writing about since that January 2009 appearance here, principally the so-called Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. And Vali's life changed dramatically too. Then a professor and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, he was just beginning a government assignment that was to last for 2 years, serving as the senior advisor to Richard Holbrooke, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Vali joined the administration with high hopes. You'll remember how in 2008, Sarah Palin denigrated Obama for his early employment. Vali writes, "I thought to myself that the Middle East could use a little political organizing." What he learned in that insider role about the conduct of American foreign policy under President Obama is what informs this new book and its very critical view of that policy. The book is dedicated to Richard Holbrooke, a person who those of us who were his friends and admirers considered an elemental life force phenomenon. Of his time with Holbrooke, Vali writes, "It was the ride of a lifetime." And of course, that observation takes on added poignancy in the knowledge that Holbrooke's lifetime was to end abruptly in December 2010, after he suffered a ruptured aorta in the midst of a meeting with Hillary Clinton in her office. The disillusionment Vali was to experience as he watched Holbrooke and his vision being thwarted by the White House began right here at the UN, and that's where the book begins as well. It was the 2009 opening of the General Assembly across the street, the annual gathering of foreign ministers and heads of state and government that floods this community every September. And Holbrooke, a former American ambassador who was a master of UN diplomacy, was trying to sell disbelieving foreign diplomats on the wisdom of the Obama strategy for defeating the insurgency and building democracy in Afghanistan. Holbrooke himself and Vali had other very different ideas of how best to move forward in Afghanistan, but they had lost the internal argument, and Holbrooke was being, as Vali puts it, a loyal soldier. The book is academically sound, as you would expect from a dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a former professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. But it is also boldly opinionated and not afraid to make some ominous predictions. It has a sense of history, and Vali compares the present moment in the Middle East to where Europe was in 1914, with outbreaks of sectarian violence, and where Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe were with the unraveling of authoritarian regimes in the 1980s. The book is highly contemporary, with provocative and disturbing forecasts about what the Arab Spring may end up producing, and how the rivalry between the West and China might play out at a time when the Obama administration seeks to pivot away from the Middle East and towards Asia. Vali notes tellingly that the term for the region frequently used in China is not Middle East, but West Asia. Born in Iran, Vali has seen expectation and subsequent disappointment dating back to his youth. At one point in the book, he calls himself a child of the Iranian Revolution. And that gives particularly force to his statement in the book that, quote, Egyptian liberal Democrats are no more likely to win the future than were their Iranian counterparts back in 1979. While the book is troubling, it is in the end a cri de coeur for the power of diplomacy and engagement, for a policy that is less reliant on military means abroad and domestic partisan concerns at home, and more centered on trade and development, and ultimately one that doesn't shy away from the responsibility Vali believes America has of providing global leadership. Vali, welcome back to IPI, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Warren, for that wonderful introduction. It is great being back here. I very well remember when I came to IPI 4 years ago for talking about my previous book, and what a rich discussion we had. I'm also very gratified that so many of our alumni of SAIS are here tonight with us. I think we've already accomplished something very new of a alliance between a think tank and a School of International Affairs, which is innovative in itself. And I think it's, as I was just looking at that great view, that this is probably a very appropriate location for the discussion of this book. I wrote this book with two concerns in mind. One is that I do think that something important is happening in the Middle East that is important globally, and that the United States and also Europe and the international community is fairly disengaged with it, and it is disengaged at great risk. And I enumerate what that risk is in the region of not paying attention to this region. Secondly, I also think that it is a very critical moment in our thinking about foreign policy and our place in the world, and how we think we ought to play our role and how others think we ought to play our role. I know we've been consumed by our domestic agenda, particularly by economic pressures that we feel at home. But I also think as a nation, not just the administration, but also as a nation, we're hiding behind that argument. And just because there are economic problems at home, it doesn't mean that the world issues are going to take a hiatus. And I think actually, as Warren mentioned, that there are particular problems in the sense that we have lost the ability to use diplomacy effectively. And we still have to sort out how do we place foreign policy in the right perspective, in the context of our domestic interests and agenda, but also in the context of what we think about our military power and military might and how we use it globally. So as Warren said, the beginning point of thinking about this book for me was September 2009, where United Nations General Assembly takes place. I remember at our mandate, at that time, the administration was going to do a strategic review for the Afghanistan war. The Afghanistan war was the administration's #1 foreign policy issue. I think the president spent 25 hours and many, many meetings that fall going through the review. And there were many more meetings at the cabinet level and then at the deputy secretary level. At points, it looked like the entirety of U.S. government was engaged in this question of what is the appropriate strategy for the United States going forward. But there was a sense that we were going to put many more troops on the ground, and we all understood that we had to convince the world that we were really serious about Afghanistan. And the people we had to convince were Europeans, were the Turks, were the Chinese, were the Russians, but were also countries in and around Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and then ultimately the real audience for this show of seriousness were really the Taliban and the Afghan people and the Afghan government. And I remember going with Richard Holbrooke, from mission to mission. I think actually UNGA, the time of United Nations General Assembly, it's kind of like speed dating, diplomatic speed dating. I mean, you go to meeting after meeting, and Holbrooke would lay out what was the administration's thinking about our commitment, about the fact that we were going to put enough troops on the ground to defeat the Taliban, and we were committed to defeating the Taliban. And the first shock, as somebody who was still new to the government, was the polite incredulity that we saw in the face of everybody who we spoke to. And I remember at one point in a meeting with a foreign minister from the Arab world that he basically, I guess he lost patience with us. And he just turned to Holbrooke and said, why don't you just pay the warlords to protect the territory from Al-Qaeda and then leave? It's going to cost you $20 billion at the most. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier. And just pay to buy the protection. Forget about all of this, surging of troops and nation building and creating a Switzerland in the middle of the Hindu Kush. It was not that whether or not this made sense, but it was actually, to me, it sounded at how far off our perception of our strategy and the way others saw it was from the reality on the ground. And I remember going literally to a next meeting to another Arab foreign minister who repeated the same thing, except he discounted the price to $1 billion. And he also said, you're going to fail. This isn't going to work. You're going to come in, you're going to go put troops, you're not going to achieve anything, and you're going to fail. And when you fail, it is bad for the region, it's bad for us, and it's bad for you. Take our advice. Just give the money to the warlords. They're much better at counterinsurgency than you are, and they will take care of the problem. So there was, obviously, funding the warlords would not fly. But the key question to me then, why were we so insistent on putting more troops on the ground? Why, off the bat, virtually a month after the president came in, you already committed to 17,000 more troops? And at some level, the answer was obvious. It was the Iraq overhang. I mean, the irony of it was that this was a president who was elected because he challenged the Iraq war, because he challenged our putting troops in, and because he promised he would finish that war. But in an ironic way, he was not able to move his own new strategy for a war that he was now beginning to own from the shadow of the Iraq war. The Iraq overhang was there. Iraq was a disaster that civilians caused and the military saved. That's the way it was seen. It was the military who came up with the search strategy. It was the military that came up with the idea of a counterinsurgency, what we call in short COIN. And the military had been the savior of the day. And this triumphant military would not tolerate basically an Afghan strategy that was anything other than the Iraq strategy. And really the administration, I think, early on just gave in to that. And that was a domestic consideration. So it was very clear we were going to go down this path. And when you look at, if you read Bob Woodward's book, my experience sitting there and doing this was that the president really didn't want this strategy. He kept asking the same questions in a different language again and again. He went over this months at a time. And in the end, he did give General McChrystal what he asked for with some modifications. But ultimately, the domestic consideration dominated the way we approached Afghanistan. And the only people who saw through this were the people who were the customers of our strategy, which is the Taliban, Karzai, the countries around. They all knew that this isn't going to work and we're not going to stand behind it. Now, there was another idea out there. Many Europeans, the British, Norwegians, other Germans were telling us that, look, there is a diplomatic path here. The Taliban are making the right sounds. Karzai has been wanting to talk. Why don't you think of a diplomatic strategy? And I remember one of my colleagues, Barnett Rubin, who like me joined the team. Before he started, he went to Afghanistan and he met with one of the former Taliban commanders, Mullah Zaif, who had come out of the Taliban, who basically outlined for him what the structure of a reconciliation deal would be. Down to what steps ought to be taken for confidence building, what might be the elements of it, and what is the Taliban willing to give up and what is it willing to compromise on. And Holbrooke heard all of this, and Holbrooke came to the conclusion that the surge is a mistake. The surge is a mistake because the surge to him was a sprint, and what he thought Afghanistan needed was a marathon. He thought that if you surged, you'll withdraw faster. The more troops you put in, the costlier it is, the less you're going to stay. So you're going to bite into a war that is 130,000 troops. It includes nation building, agriculture building, economic building, democracy building, and at the end it costs us about $100 billion a year, and that's a very conservative estimate. When you do that, you're going to fold quickly. It's much better that you put a lot less in, but it's credible to everybody around. They actually can believe in their hearts that you're going to stay longer. When you tell them you're going to stay longer, it looks credible to them. And then use that to basically push for a diplomatic solution, push for a political settlement that would allow you to leave Afghanistan with leaving something concrete behind. Now, this idea is basically what he was saying is that the United States has to go back to giving foreign policy to diplomats. Whereas our foreign policy, even to this day, does not belong to diplomats. It belongs to military and security. And the military and security thought that, Iraq didn't end up around the negotiating table. Why should Afghanistan? And I remember General Petraeus said it always affectionately that Holbrooke is my wingman. But Holbrooke always personally would say, since when is it that diplomats have become generals as wingmen? It wasn't like that in Bosnia. The diplomat was in charge. The job of the general was to scare Milosevic into compromising. It was the same at the end of Vietnam. The job of the military was to make Kissinger much stronger at the negotiating table. Whereas the way it was working in the State Department is the job of the diplomat was to facilitate the job of the general. So the job of the diplomat was to go around the world and get material support for the war, not to find a solution. Now, the irony is that Holbrooke's solution never got a hearing. When you read Bob Woodward's book, there are two options before the president: a fully resourced counterinsurgency, or what Vice President Biden was promoting, a counterterrorism strategy, which means that we just leave. We shouldn't be fighting this fight at all. We just leave. We don't care what happens. We can protect ourselves against Al-Qaeda using drones and using special forces. There was no diplomatic strategy on the table. The White House never considered it. It's not something the president considered, debate, either accept or reject. And I think the reason for that largely was the way in which the decision-making apparatus at the White House is set up, which is to exclude initiative and ideas coming from the State Department, and that is largely partial to domestic political considerations, which in our time favors the military, because nobody ever gets punished for siding with the tough option, whereas diplomacy does bear certain risks and political costs. Now, the end result of this is that the strategy was good for a year. Following year, we came to Anga and went to the region and told the same foreign ministers that, what we told you last year, that we're going to be here for a long time, we're not. We actually believe we've won and we're going home by 2014. And we have this narrative that we think is good enough for us, which is we haven't defeated the Taliban. We don't need a peace process. We're just going to hand over the war that we couldn't finish to this Afghan security force that we're going to build. And again, there was incredulousness. And some of them said, including a Pakistani general who said, look, this military you want to build is going to fall apart. When it falls apart, it's going to be a problem for us. If you want to leave, leave. Just don't try anything on your way out. That's going to make things work. We never believed you're going to stay. And now, just training the Afghans to shoot more straight than they are, and then they're going to disband. And in fact, in the region, the bet really is, will the Afghan military we're building break up sooner than the Afghan military the Soviets built when they left. So we haven't won. We haven't ended up with a deal. And worse than, I think, all of it is that we haven't solved the Iraq overhang. In other words, still our main mode of engagement with the region is security, except instead of coin, it's drones. Instead of the military, it's special forces. But that's our real mode of engagement. Still, we are not diplomatically engaged. And I think, going forward, something else also became more clear, that philosophically, we are pushing for an idea that we don't need to do as much in the world. We don't really need to be at the forefront of convening global authority to address global problems. And in particular, that we really don't need to do this in the Middle East. And we really should downgrade the Middle East in global politics. So I think when the president told the New Republic recently, how do I square off tens of thousands of people dying in Syria with tens of thousands of people dying in Congo, basically he meant that the Middle East should matter just about the same amount that Central Africa does. So it shouldn't be as pivotal a place as we viewed it. Now, I think there's a problem in that for two reasons. One is that Middle East refuses to be ignored, as we can see. It's actually, I think, is doubling down on producing crisis the more we are trying to leave it. But secondly, we forget that the Middle East has been the measure of America's foreign policy for over a decade. Everybody else is looking at what we achieved here, what our commitments are, and how we calculate the Middle East in terms of what it means for their own. I mean, recently, a very senior official from Southeast Asia said to me that doesn't matter what the United States says about Asia, what it does in the Middle East, that it matters. How it treats its allies in the Middle East matters to us. And the Chinese and the North Koreans are looking at whether you're willing to put red lines down on Syria and enforce them or not. That's where they get their gauge. And therefore, the Middle East is a measure of something a lot more. And if you look at it now, we are disengaged with the Middle East. We are not engaged on the Arab Spring. The president saw it fit to reward the Burmese general with a 6-hour visit for loosening up the system. He's yet to visit a country that went through the Arab Spring. He went to the Middle East recently. He decided to focus on the Arab-Israeli issue, which is the perennial problem in the region. But the future of the Middle East is being decided in Syria and Egypt. What comes out of these two countries will decide the shape of the future. And we clearly, his signal trip to the Middle East was not about these two countries. It was about the other issue, which has been there before and will be thereafter. We're doing all of this in the context that we want to pivot to Asia. That's where global trade is happening. That's where the future of global politics, we believe, will be. And we're going there to prevent China from establishing hegemony in its neighborhood, in disputes, over trade. It's very clearly a containment of China's strategy. The problem is that we think Asia means Asia Pacific, whereas the Chinese think Asia means Asia, which means from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Japan. Industrial centers, population centers in China are moving west. The Chinese are investing in Central Asia, in Persian Gulf, in Turkey, in Iran, in Pakistan. They're investing in energy sources, in pipelines, in railways, in roads. They're developing markets. Their sovereign fund is investing in the region. They're connecting countries together. They're building pipelines that go from Central Asia to the port facility in Pakistan. They're building railway that will take oil and gas and goods all the way from Turkey through Iran to Pakistan. If you went to northern Iraq today, one of the most sought after skills is Mandarin-speaking lawyers. There's so much Chinese business coming into northern Iraq. And for the Chinese, the Middle East is not a declining strategic concern. It's a rising strategic concern. Their approach to the Middle East is very much like their approach to Africa. They're playing a long game of building relations and building an economy. And our view, if that's how we're justifying it, that we're downsizing our engagement in Europe, and especially in the Middle East and everywhere else, because we need to focus on China, this is not a credible strategy. This is not credible at the face of it, and it actually misses the point that the Chinese are not just competing with us in Asia Pacific, they're competing everywhere else. And I think, therefore, the totality of these, to me, suggests that, it's important for us to think about this. I think American leadership around the world matters. First of all, because, all of our faults and overreach and problems notwithstanding, a world without American influence and stabilizing role and leadership would be a lot more chaotic and problematic. And it's very clear, the Arab world can't get its act together on Syria. The world can't get its act together on Syria without American leadership. I often hear people say that, well, people were plenty unhappy with the Bush administration foreign policy and that we bungled a lot. But I would say the answer to a bad foreign policy is no foreign policy. The answer to having made mistakes in the Middle East and elsewhere is not to completely abandon it. And I don't think the world is really ready for this. You can't go from an American leadership everywhere to American leadership nowhere. And that creates a lot more turbulence. Anyways, let me stop here, and I'd be very happy to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you, Vali. I've got 2 or 3 questions for Vali right now. We'll have a little conversation, and then I'll hear from you. I neglected to say, and should have said in the outset, there are books for sale outside, and when we're through here, before 8 o'clock, Vali will stick around to sign those books and also to chat with any of you who want to speak to him individually. Vali, just a couple of points I'd like to ask you from the book. One of them is Iran. You argue in the book that American policy or Western policy right now will probably produce a result of Iran being a failed state, and that would be a very bad development. You also make the ancillary point that the Chinese, we are pushing the Iranians towards the Chinese. Could you just expand upon that, please?
Well, largely because we have the Bush administration created a policy of sanctions leading to talks with Iran. It's called the dual track policy, which is that in order to get them to the table, there is the threat of military force always there, although the Iranians no longer take that seriously, but that we would use sanctions to get them amenable to talks. But in reality, both under the Bush administration and Obama administration, this has been largely a single-track policy of sanctions, but very little really engagement on diplomacy. Now, Iran is now really feeling the pain of sanctions in a serious way. And I think for Iran, its number one national security objective is getting rid of sanctions. That's the national objective. The question is, how do you get rid of sanctions? You either have to be able to negotiate them away, which is not likely because I don't think we're serious about negotiations. We're not serious about negotiations because we confuse the willingness to talk and showing up to a meeting with actually talking. Serious negotiation means that we have to be willing to put something on the table the other side is willing to consider. So we've had 4 negotiations with Iran over the past, I would say, 6 months. And in these, we've asked for Iran to give up its nuclear program by and large, lock, stock, and barrel, in exchange for which all we have offered is aircraft spare parts. And none of the sanctions that actually were to get them to the table are on the table for consideration for the negotiation, which to them means that we're not really serious about this. In other words, when you ask them to give up 120 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, the reward for that is not that the oil embargo would be lifted or the banking sanctions would be relaxed. Basically, the reward for that is nothing. Your good behavior will be taken into consideration in the future. So if the Iranians come to a conclusion that for domestic reasons, for the political pressure that the administration would feel if it were actually to put something substantial on the table, that there's not going to be a diplomatic path to lifting the sanctions, then they will calculate that it's much better to follow a North Korea option, which is to literally build a bomb because it gives you a lot more leverage. And if people in Tehran are watching what happened in North Korea, they clearly see that as a winning strategy. That the young North Korean leader has a lot more ability to get concessions from South Korea and the West because he has credible nuclear capability. Now, so at some level, we're at a very critical juncture. If we don't take diplomacy with Iran seriously, and if we don't put aside domestic pressures and really look at this as a foreign policy issue, we're running the danger of actually encouraging Iran to become nuclear. Sanctions from here on will encourage. The other part of it is that as much pressure as you put on Iran, it is unlikely that the Iranians will simply surrender. And if we looked at Iraq, Saddam was not willing to admit they didn't have nuclear capability. And there is a reason for that, because there was a geostrategic fear of neighbors, of a country that has no access to weapons otherwise, and that you want that myth of having some kind of deterrence, and that's true of Iranians as well. And therefore, the Iranians will just try to survive the sanctions. And we saw what sanctions did to Iraq. It basically turned state institutions to dust. It destroyed the middle class. It made Iraq into the economic, social morass that we encountered when we arrived in Baghdad. Evidence of that is very apparent in Iran. The Iranian middle class is withering away. That's the class that was behind the Green Movement. Another few years of this, you're going to have very educated taxi drivers and mechanics in Iran, but not a real middle class. And also there are parts of Iran where you have local power brokers are gaining control of territory, crime, drugs, contraband. All of this is rising, and essentially central authority in Iran is gradually softening up. On the other hand, is that what degree of trade and economic relationship exists is happening with China. So Iranian manufacturing is moving to China and then re-exporting back to Iran. Iran is selling oil and gas to China. It's importing Chinese material. I remember 2 years ago, I asked an Iranian businessman, what was the real consequence of sanctions for your business? He said, the real consequence of sanctions is that we're all learning Mandarin. And ultimately, this is China's becoming the lifeblood for Iran. China cannot satisfy all of Iran's economic interests, but one of the results is that we're pushing China in that direction. You can add to that, I think, the way we've handled our Pakistan policy, which has only pushed Pakistan also into the bosom of both China and Iran. So in a sense, we've helped create an arc, if you would, of countries there with which we have difficult relations, and all of whom are now looking much more to China.
That's the same arc that China is
also
influencing right now, isn't it? Just one more point on Iran before we leave it. I know the president has said that containment is no longer an option. As I see it, I don't really believe we're going to go to war at some point to prevent Iran from getting the bomb. So I think they are going to either get the bomb or at least get the capability of building the bomb. How can you take containment off the table when that's the likely policy we're going to end up with?
Well, first of all, the president of the United States has a right to change his mind.
Okay.
And secondly, I actually think we are doing containment, except we're not calling it containment. But thirdly, I don't think the threat of war is realistic here. If we're not willing to go into some kind of a engagement with Syria, then we're not going to do it with Iran. Because every argument we're giving about why we don't want to do Syria, you can multiply that by 10 and say that's Iran. Size of the country, air defense systems, you break it, you own it. All of that applies to Iran as well. And I think the real critical test is going to come over whether the Syrian government actually did use sarin gas, and if it did, how pink or how red our red line is. And that ultimately means that if we have tolerance for even modest use of a weapon of mass destruction, then we can tolerate 20% enriched uranium in Iran so long as it's not actually put in a warhead. So that's what different pieces of this don't necessarily relate to one another. And I think the Iranians have every incentive to continue with the program, because the longer they have the program, the more they build, the more leverage they have in negotiating whatever they're going to get. So the only way, I think, if we're going to go to war, that's one thing, but I really don't think we are, and they know it. And I think everybody around the region knows it. And so the only way we're going to sort of get their attention, if you put something big on the table that's worth talking about, which means that there have to be significant sanctions on the table as quid pro quos for significant things they give up. I'm not saying necessarily it works, but currently nothing is on the table. So the Iranian calculation is, well, clearly they don't take us seriously enough to give a concession, a real concession. So maybe in 6 months' time, with so many more centrifuges and a little closer to a point of no return, they actually will come back to the table with something serious. So, the point is that there is no real diplomacy here. And I think it's time for us to actually really try diplomacy with Iran.
Just one last question, and then we'll go to the floor. Richard Holbrooke was very close to Hillary Clinton. You saw it, I saw it. She must have seen what was happening to Richard, the almost humiliation of Richard Holbrooke in the Obama administration. What did she do? Could she have stopped it? Could she have prevented it? Did she try to?
She did, and she stood behind Richard Holbrooke on a number of occasions. And also she did advocate a lot of those ideas. And I do think that, she used her own personal relationship with the president and her own standing to push for many policy areas that initially, had it not been for her, they wouldn't have happened, including participation in the Libya campaign. Would not have happened without her. And I think, on many areas of asserting America's global leadership, I think she really pushed and she got her way on plenty of occasions. But, she supported Richard on varieties of occasions, pushed for issues. But what could not have been changed, and it only takes the president to change it, is actually the structure of decision-making about foreign policy, the way that it's set up. Because, part of the problem is in the structure. It's in the way in which the apparatus in the White House has been set up to manage options that go to the president and prioritize our foreign policy in a particular way. And the attitude generally that exists, that the foreign policy is centralized in the White House, the president is the chief strategist, the policy is formulated there, and the job of the agencies of the government is to implement. And ultimately, those agencies fight very hard for their views, but sometimes they don't win. So we know that the Secretary of State and the head of the CIA, with the support of the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I mean, these are the four most powerful people in the NSC, argued for an aggressive U.S. involvement in Syria, including arming the rebels. So, and they articulated and said this, but clearly it was not their decision. The decision was above them, and ultimately they are expected to implement the current policy that on Syria that is formulated at the White House. So the issue is largely structural. It's not a matter of personalities. I don't think it's going to make a difference if one Secretary of State goes and comes. I think actually Hillary Clinton, because of his international standing and because of her force of personalities, and often people don't know that, she was the one woman and the one civilian often in a NSC that's National Security Council, that dominated by men and largely security and military, that not only she held her own, but she was probably the strongest personality in the room often. But, and she used that very effectively, I think, and on varieties of issues and on many issues to do with Afghanistan and Pakistan, she used it very, very appropriately. But ultimately, she's not the president. She doesn't create the structure at the NSC. That structure is there, and ultimately it requires the president to define how foreign policy is made.
Vali, you've mentioned Syria a couple of times. Is it clear to you what the United States ought to be doing now in Syria?
It's definitely more than what it is doing. And I think it starts very simply with indicating to the world that it takes Syria seriously, to signal that it does believe that the United States has an interest in the outcome, and that it does understand the danger that Syria poses to the entire region. That Syria is not just a humanitarian tragedy and a pro-democracy uprising against the dictator. That Syria is a much bigger problem. And it won't end with Assad going, I think. Actually, it may be the beginning. And I think that's a very powerful signal. We don't have to start by sending brigades into Syria. We can start actually by providing real humanitarian support for the million refugees, Syrian refugees, which actually the State Department expects will rise to 3 million by the end of 2013. If you went to Jordan, Lebanon, we're not providing anything, and we're not leading the world in providing anything. Secondly, we can send the signal that we're serious about getting the Syrian opposition in order. We're not engaged, so the Saudis and the Qataris are fighting over different candidates, and the Syrian opposition has become ineffective. We have to take the leadership to turn this into what was the Afghan opposition in the Bonn conference, or the Iraqi opposition on the eve of the invasion, which means that we at least should be talking to the Qataris and the Saudis, which we're not doing. And thirdly, we have to get serious about global diplomacy here. There is a way to get the Russian and the Chinese to a different place, but it requires real engagement. And the president should appoint a senior level envoy and empower him as to do this. And then, the no-fly zone is important. We have to take that seriously, not just to stop the butchery, but to keep the refugees inside of Syria instead of putting pressure on the neighboring countries. And ultimately, I do think we should be arming the rebels. The reason that we now have the difficulty of dealing with Al-Qaeda is because we didn't arm it in the first place. The lesson we should have learned from Afghanistan is that it is better for the United States to be doing the arming directly rather than let intelligence and militaries of other countries to do it. The Mujahideen issue went wrong because we let the Saudis and the Pakistanis to do the intermediary management. And we're letting that happen again in Syria. So we're letting Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar decide who are they going to give the weapons to. The relationships develop with them. There's no vetting. It would have been much better if the United States had done this. And I still think, end of the day, large parts of Syria are now failed state, no man's land. Somebody has to go in and clean house. And that somebody ultimately will end up being us in one way or another. So we may as well, get with it and start the process sooner.
If you would raise your hand, I'll call on you, and please wait for the microphone. And I think what we'll do about, Vali, I think I'll take about 3 questions at once, and then we can answer them after that. So I'll start there in the corner, and then this will be the second one, and the gentleman, your hand there. So,
Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
I'm Susan Bender, and Warren and I know each other a little bit, just a little bit. I wanted to ask you, the one thing that you have not spoken about is the American economy and how it has influenced Obama's policies with regard to all of these areas. For example, the Asian pivot that Hillary Clinton spoke about was very much an economically driven issue. So I'd like to hear you apply that a little more to Syria, Afghanistan, et cetera.
Okay, and the second.
Oh, thank you.
No, yeah, there you are.
Hello, I'm Katya Chavchavadze, Redpath. I'm a SAIS alum. Wonderful talk, thank you. I wanted to ask you, with a kind of pessimistic title that you have in your book, and also the pessimism, frankly, that I share with the sort of domestic pressures on American foreign policy and the failures that you're describing in the structure. What you see for more an overall picture strategically about not just the rise of China, but maybe some of the other players, possibly Russia, any nuclear terrorist potential, anything else you'd like to raise? Thank you.
Okay, and the gentleman with the red tie, I think, were you not the third person? Yep.
So my question regards Iran.
Hold it up a little bit.
You had mentioned that, Philip Bianchi, class of 2012, SAIS. My question regards Iran. You had mentioned that diplomacy should be encouraged, and we should consider making some concrete proposals with respect to various sanctions that we have on the regime. What kind of a sanction, though, or a lifting of a sanction would encourage them to not pursue nuclear weapons, given the enormous advantage it's going to confer upon the regime? And secondly, we have gone back and forth with North Korea over many years, and there have been concessions, and that seemed to not produce the desired result at all. So how do we prevent diplomatic negotiations with Iran from just becoming a way to prolong development of a nuclear weapon and to keep our eye off the ball?
Good. If you could answer those three, we'll take three more.
Sure. Let me start with the last one about diplomacy. You know, the sanctions were very specifically put forward in order to get them to the table. So getting to the table then means you have to have something to talk about. So those very sanctions are really the reason they came to the table. So it was the reason why they might give something up. So, you know, we have a bevy of sanctions on them. Some of them are United Nations backed sanctions. Some are unilateral American sanctions. Actually, the toughest ones are unilateral American and unilateral European sanctions on banking, on exports, on insurance, on use of SWIFT, on oil embargo. You know, there's a varieties of these. So, you know, these, and it is possible that you negotiate and what you're offering is not enough. I'm not saying that, you know, there is a straight formula, but currently there is nothing on the table. So these sanctions are not going to be lifted. Basically, the way Iran looks at it is that what if we gave up the nuclear program? How do we guarantee, what guarantee we have that you actually will lift the sanctions? The supreme leader is on record saying, well, you know, once they get the nuclear issue, they're going to ask for Hezbollah and Hamas, and then they're going to ask for human rights in Iran, and then ask for democracy. And he's always said that this is not about nuclear issue, this is about regime change. And this is not going to stop. So ultimately, I think the way to go forward is step by step. You have to say, I'll give you one thing and you give one thing, and if we both give it, okay, we have some trust, then we negotiate about the next thing and the next thing. And let me say, with Iran, it's going to be very difficult. And it's not going to be short run. It's going to be trenchant. It's going to be long run. And on North Korea, you know, North Korea right now is a different place because its leverage is very different. But, you know, it is possible to think that, you know, is there a price for certain things with North Korea? And the question is, you know, are we willing to pay the price? It's always in any negotiation, it's always a question of what price are you paying for what you want, and whether the other side thinks it's worth the compromise or not. On the title, you know, the reason I use this title, because I think, you know, we often have said we're an indispensable nation, and the president repeated that that's our goal, that's the way we view ourselves. But increasingly, what we're conveying to the outside is that they really shouldn't think of us as the indispensable nation who's going to come in, lead the world, provide the convening power, be willing to do the kinds of things is done in many other conflicts. So in a sense, we want them to think of us as dispensable, that they should do it on their own. And then maybe we'll follow, maybe we won't. And therefore, we have to be prepared for that characterization. If we're not relevant to Syria, then we're dispensable in that regard. And if we're telling the Middle East that we really don't want to have anything to do with the Arab Spring, we're not going to put the kind of money we put in for Mexico, Eastern Europe, Russia, etc., in terms of economic restructuring. If our engagement is minimal, is reactive, then what we basically are telling them is that you should think of us in a dispensable way. I think the rise of emerging markets generally is a very big challenge for us because you have a certain distribution of economic wealth and power around the world, and that does raise certain challenges in terms of how we ought to think about the world and what should be the nature of our leadership around the world. But I think still none of the emerging markets or no collectivity of the emerging markets can currently take over from A, the United States, and B, from institutions that the United States has helped build. And in fact, I think it really again falls on the United States' shoulders to help the emerging markets to create some kind of a global institution around which they can exercise power. Now, about the American economy, clearly a lot of the backdrop to the current conversation is that we really can't afford foreign policy because we have a lot of issues at home. There is truth in that. But the problem is that foreign issues, opportunities, and crises don't take a hiatus. You can't put a pause button on them while we sort out our domestic issues. And therefore, I don't think we should hide behind this argument. We should rather try to find out ways in which we can address our interests globally and yet address our domestic issues. And I think, yes, the pivot to Asia was economic in many ways, but also it has a very strong military and political component. One of the first acts of the pivot was to announce putting 2,500 Marines in Australia, building a new defense relationship with Vietnam, Philippines, and India. And so it very clearly was about containing China. And containing China, as I said, is not just over there. Containing China will happen elsewhere. And then we can't serve our economic interests in Asia or contain China if the Asian countries are looking at the Middle East and are making different kinds of conclusions about our commitments and our abilities. And I think we cannot have a compartmentalized view of the world, of saying, we're just going to do Asia and we don't need to worry about Europe and the Middle East, for instance.
I have the front row, then the gentleman there raising your hand, and we'll go to the second row. Those three.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ann Phillips. I'm on the board of the IPI. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And I must say, I have not read your book yet. I'm very eager to read it. But everything I've read about it and everything you've said today is so important and so significant that I want you to know, as an American, I'm grateful to you for giving voice to this point of view. What bewilders me is, why are there no other voices out there? Why is there such a, to use a corny metaphor, a curtain of silence, if you will, that has sort of seemed to cover criticism, cover these observations? After all, what you've observed and what you've given voice to are not secrets. They're very apparent what's going on, and yet we don't hear from the intellectual community and the diplomatic community criticism such as yours. And I think that this silence, this reluctance to criticize, is having a very deleterious effect on our country. What is this reluctance all about? I mean, when Bush was president, everybody was aware and discussing about the competition and the conflict between the Defense Department and the State Department, and many of his policies were criticized openly. Why not now? Thank you very, very much.
Average SITES graduate, member of the SITES Advisory Council. Dean Nasr, I noticed that in your discussion about the Iranian situation, you didn't mention Israel one time. There was a time, once upon a time, when we talk about Iran and what to do about that. The concern was that Israel had a red line, which was much more aggressive than our red line. Now, recently the president went to Israel, and he kind of had a love fest with Bibi, which was very interesting to note. Does that suggest that Bibi has decided to totally follow the lead of the United States and not to do anything precipitous? Or am I reading this incorrectly?
Got it. And the third one, yes, here in the second row.
I'm Shazia Rafi from Parliamentarians for Global Action. And it's not just the SAIS alums who are here, there's also a Fletcher alum. Just going back to the period when you were talking about Holbrooke's mandate when he was first appointed, there was reports that in addition to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India was possibly going to be part of his arc of mandate. But then at some point that was taken off. Could you say a little bit about why and at whose request? And also, why was Iran never part of that arc? Because if, one was to look at containing China, in a sense, that should have been the arc to solve Afghanistan.
Okay.
Well, to the first question, I don't know why there's not more of problematizing our foreign policy. But I also think that perhaps until now it was easy to get away with the idea that less foreign policy is better, or we don't need to do much. But I think now there is a greater sense of urgency because the number of crises that are coming up, you take North Korea, you take Syria, you take Iran, that is pushing the boundaries of, can we really afford to be completely insular? I think even at some level down the road, the Boston Marathon bombing would also, again, take us to the fact that, you might have a very ambitious domestic agenda, but, events happening somewhere else relating to the previous concern we had, which is still live and well, can, rain on your parade and can change the narrative domestically, and that we really cannot afford to be disengaged. And I think, Chechnya raises interesting questions because, it's a question about how lingering this sort of damage that a war like we're seeing in Syria can have. And you could say Hafez Assad is doing to Syria what Putin did to Chechnya. And you could then say, what are we looking at down the road, or we ought to be looking at it. So my hope in writing this was really to basically force a debate, because I think, we have to think hard about this. And if we decide that we want a lesser role in international affairs, we have to do so with eyes wide open, both in terms of what it means and what the consequences would be. Frank, your point on Israel is very well taken. I think, this is a very difficult and nuanced and subjective interpretation. There are those who would say that, from the very beginning, the Prime Minister of Israel was very hamstrung by the public way in which many generals in Israel came out against war. And that is really an open question whether Israel could go to war with Iran without the US support. So there are those who think that, we all along were hiding behind the Israel red line of saying, well, if you don't talk to us, then, the Israelis would do it on their own. I'm not sure that many people in the Middle East buy that argument. At the end of the day, Israel would be able to really carry a effective campaign against Iran without American support or without promise of American follow-up. So I think, by and large, this is an open question. So now increasingly, it's also evident because of Syria that we really don't want to get involved in wars. And that lesson cannot be lost on the Iranians. And I think that worries the Israelis, that the Iranians are looking at Syria and saying, well, every argument the Americans give, it means that if you put your toe in the water, you have to dive in. And by that logic, then you don't want to put your toe in Iran's water. I think it's not coincidental that it's Israel that has raised the issue of the sarin gas and is really challenging the administration on a red line that it put down. It basically wants to say, well, here's a red line you put down. If these guys are using it in Syria, and if they're using it, the Iranians know it. And the Iranians know that the Israelis and Americans know it. So it's a way of, sort of basically pushing us on the Iran issue. You can't if the Iranians come to a conclusion that red lines in Syria are breachable, then, there's no holding back with that. The India issue was actually raised by the president at one point during the campaign by saying that, Kashmir should be on the table. The Indians very early on let it be known that if Kashmir is part of AFPAC, Afghanistan-Pakistan policy, Holbrooke's not going to get a visa to India, just like I think at one point they denied Kofi Annan a visa to India. And Holbrooke was not gunning for doing Kashmir. He very quickly decided, and he said it, that first of all, if Indians are likely to cooperate outside of the policy, it's better than putting him in the policy and get non-cooperation. And he also always said that tying Afghanistan to India was asking for failure. If you tie a very complicated situation to an insoluble one, you may as well not even try at the beginning. So I think his strategy was not to solve Kashmir. His strategy was to get India and Pakistan to arrive at a minimum common understanding on Afghanistan around which they could support a regional peace treaty. Although he never got to that. But I described this at length in the book, that he did his own rogue diplomacy of shuttling between Islamabad and New Delhi and talking to both sides about would they be willing to talk about Afghanistan. Not about anything else, about Afghanistan. And both sides at the beginning said no, but they hadn't met Richard Holbrooke yet. And he persisted and persisted. And the week before he died, finally India came through and said they were willing to talk to Pakistan if it would remain limited to Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis gave their okay. And end of that week, Richard Holbrooke died when I had his heart condition. So that idea sort of died on there. But and on the issue of Iran, again, I detailed this in the book. Holbrooke believed that we should engage Iran and that we could walk and chew gum at the same time. Hillary Clinton believed that, although she was very hawkish on Iran. He believed we could be very hawkish on the nuclear issue, but we should be able to engage them on Afghanistan and find ways to bring them into some kind of a regional support for an end game. But the White House thought that you don't talk to Iran about anything other than the nuclear issue. So if you talk to them about the nuclear issue, about Afghanistan, they think you're soft and they won't compromise on the nuclear issue. Well, guess what? We didn't get anywhere with them on the nuclear issue, and we didn't get anything out of them on Afghanistan either.
Excellent. Woman in the corner there, and then Stephen Schlesinger, and then this woman here.
Hi, Professor Nasr, Fletcher, 2012, Dean Nasr.
That's right. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. I'm coming from a sort of different direction, and I work at the Open Society on the Latin America program. And I was interested to hear you say, if nobody cleans up Syria's mess, we're going to anyway. And these are and that the United States needs to be engaged because the world isn't ready for the United States to disengage. Well, in Latin America, I think people were saying that about 30 years ago, and we did disengage. And it's turning out okay. Brazil, everything's working. So it may not be a good comparison because the dictatorships and the revolutions that happened there are different than the Arab Spring, but I'm just curious about how you feel about the fact that regions that we once thought our intervention was absolutely essential, how they've come on their own to be managing their own affairs quite nicely.
Good point.
Okay, Stephen?
Stephen Schlesinger. You mention in your book that when Obama came into office, that he was very deferential to the intelligence services and the Defense Department. There seems to be a common theme among Democratic presidents that they have to prove their toughness by always caving into the military or the intelligence when they're dealing with foreign policy. And I'm wondering, I guess the question is, how does a Democratic president, or how does any president actually, handle those generals with all their, badges on their lapels, and not look weak in terms of how the public or the opposition sees them?
Just pass the microphone. There you are.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Vali. This is Leela Nouri. I'm actually a CPI alumni. In terms of the sanctions, don't you think the Obama administration's hands are tied because the sanctions have been enacted by Congress, so it's law? And even if they wanted to put sanctions on the table as part of negotiations, it's a little bit difficult to get Congress to agree with that. So how do you think we can overcome this? And also my other question is, do you think it would have been more productive for the United States to undertake bilateral talks with Iran rather than in the framework of P5+1? Thank you.
Let me start with the last question. Yes, I think actually the P5+1 format is not effective because you cannot negotiate by committee. And there are different opinions in that committee. And, I think the Iranians would not be audacious because they have their eye on the Chinese and on the Russians. We also fear that the Chinese and the Russians may go independently and undermine an agreement. And generally, I think the P5+1 format is very good in creating an international sort of unity to pressure Iran. But it's not really the effective way of negotiating, especially because the Iranians know that the Americans hold the veto power. I mean, if the Europeans tomorrow said, well, we're willing to give them oil embargo, they can't do that without Washington's approval. So, this is a charade at some level. In fact, it's a way to make sure that real negotiation doesn't happen. So I do think that, a realistic diplomacy with Iran needs to actually change the architecture. Secondly, you're right. And in fact, that's the point of why the Iranians would say, well, what's the point of talking with the negotiating if the sanctions are unmovable? The sanctions, yes, you're right, the Congress has put them in, but it requires any administration to spend significant political capital on the Congress to force them to basically do what the administration needs. Otherwise, you may as well send a delegation from Congress to negotiate with the Iranians. And in fact, it's exactly the point that the Iranians or the North Koreans or the Iraqis before them knew that the Congress will never lift these sanctions unless there is regime change that convinces them that this is not serious.
I'm only smirking because I'm thinking sending a congressman to Iran would be the ultimate punishment for
That's
Tehran.
right.
Go ahead.
That's right. Exactly. On the issue of dealing with generals, I think, yes, you're right, particularly in 2009, as powerful as President Obama was with a landslide victory that he came in, there was the overhang of Iraq in a bad way for him, namely that the military had come out of Iraq as triumphant, as having saved the day. It's very different from Vietnam in that sense. And that it was very difficult for him not to give the military what it needed. But I think it was possible for him to use the Democratic Party in a more effective way, civilians in a more effective way, to check that power. And I think having had a diplomatic strategy that could have become the emblem for a democratic foreign policy would have been better in the long run for him. But I think it's a tough issue, and it's not done. I mean, end of the day, he sent the military to barracks, but basically sustained roughly the same mission and gave it to the CIA. So then the challenge would be, how would a democratic president deal with drones and special forces in the future in the same manner? But that's exactly why I think it's important for Democrats in particular to put emphasis on the thing that they've been great at, which is diplomacy. The Republicans in the last presidential election, particularly one in 2008 and the one before it, stood for military power. It's important that the Democrats stand for, diplomatic engagement. And the world is ready for that. I think the way that President Obama was received in Europe, the way he was received in the Middle East, he was received not because he was just the anti-Bush. He was received because in their eyes he stood for diplomacy and engagement more than anything else. So there is receptivity to an American leadership that doesn't come through the turrets of a tank alone, but comes through building institution, leaving a legacy of economic change, showing leadership in diplomacy. There is hunger for that. On disengagement from Latin America, we see the United States was very engaged at a critical moment in Latin America, which is a transformation from dictatorship to democracy, and not just at a political level, but particularly economically. Just as it was at a critical time in Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia. Now, Eastern Europe or Latin America don't have issues that require American direct engagement. But if they had, if there was a war, if there was a collapse in OAS, if there was an economic crisis, and the United States basically would say, we have no role to play, you figure it out, it would be a different scenario. In Southeast Asia, the US was very engaged with when the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98 happened. And now that Southeast Asia is facing a South China Sea problem with China, we've showed up. So, we don't have to have constant engagement, but we need to be engaged when it's necessary. And I think the best kind of engagement for us is we leave institutions behind that then sustain an order. And that's, I think, our single biggest failure in the Middle East. We've done no institution building. There's no equivalent to an OAS in the Middle East, to NATO, to any kind of a multilateral body that we have shown. And that's something we can take leadership on, and it doesn't require spending $100 billion a year and tens of thousands of American troops to do it.
Just to a couple of more questions, and then I'll encourage you to buy books and bring them up here. Woman next to Frank Savage, you've had your hand up a long time, and Enzo Viscusi in the front row. Right there.
Hi, my name is Deborah O'Reilly. I am a grad student. Seeing that North Korea is a bit of an outlier, if you were to reset policy for U.S. foreign policy for North Korea, what would be your top 3 proposals?
Well, I'm not an Asia expert, so I'm not going to give you detailed policy advice on North Korea. But I think, first of all, it's important the current North Korean behavior is driven, I think, in part by the fact that it doesn't take American threat very seriously, and that it believes that it has a lot of room to push, and that it's more likely that it would get concessions, either in the form of some sanctions being lifted or future sanctions not being imposed, rather than punishment. So I think, partly management of North Korea or any other outlier requires us to have a much more coherent global strategy, which is, our use of force, our leadership, our economic engagement, et cetera, have to be very clear. Secondly, I think it requires repairing relations with China. We cannot be aggressively taunting China, telling them that we're going to be helping all the smaller kids in the neighborhood to stand up to it, and we're going to be beefing up their military capabilities, and at the same time we want their cooperation on North Korea or on Iran. It just doesn't work that way. And thirdly, I think that we have to since we don't want to go to war with North Korea, we have to find a platform that you would have some kind of a engagement that would at least reduce the tensions to a level we can figure out a way forward.
Last question here for Enzo. And by the way, I'm sorry I can't take, there's so many questions out there. I wish I could take you all. But please know we're staying right here when we get through. And you should come forward, talk to Vali. And if you have a book in your hand, he might even be a bit more responsive.
I'll be very happy to sign it.
Enzo, your microphone.
How would a secretary...
Introduce yourself, please.
How would a Secretary of State, Richard Holbrooke, manage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is extremely difficult to solve, and largely because it requires domestic management, and then it requires regional management, and also many of the Arab partners that previously helped either are not there or are no longer willing to help us because they don't trust that if they took risks, we wouldn't let them fall or let them take the flag. And also, a lot of them have internal issues, are far more worried about Syria and Egypt than they are worried about the Arab-Israeli issue. So it requires us to, at the highest level, signal that we're prepared to find a framework for negotiations going forward, which right now is not the case. Right now, our approach is we want to encourage them to come up with willingness to do this, and then maybe we will support them. But we have to do a lot more to get the two sides to agree to a framework, which means we have to force the Palestinians to compromise, and we have to force the Israelis to compromise, because the positions are right now quite far from one another. And then we would really have to spend a lot of time and capital domestically in the United States, as well as internationally, to keep the two sides engaged and to keep them moving in the direction of an agreement. Everybody wants peace. The problem is that everybody has to pay a price and compromise. And that's where they don't want to do it. And that's where you have to be able to muster pressure on them. And so, that's what it would take. But I don't think it's the job of a Secretary of State. This really requires the president being involved, because I don't think the Israeli Prime Minister is too fazed by what a Secretary of State thinks right now.
Vali, it is a terrific book. I really commend it to all of you, and you are once again a terrific guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.